my reflections on the relationship between human dignity and religious freedom. Before presenting the three main questions I will try to address in my presentation, let me start with some introductory considerations on the status of the concepts of human dignity and religious freedom in constitutional and international law. Indeed, although the historic roots are of a very different extent, the two concepts are at present, or at least seem to be, quite deeply intertwined. As regards human dignity, it has to be pointed out first that references to it are a relatively recent phenomenon in legal discourses. Introduced by several states into their constitutions already in the first half of the 20th century, it was, however, after the Second World War that human dignity became a fundamental element of constitutional and international law. This development did not come as a surprise if we consider the huge violation of human rights and the civilization breakdown occurred during the war. Since the civilizing dimension of positive law could not prevent human beings as individuals and peoples as a whole from behaving worse than brutes towards fellow humans, the necessity was broadly felt that a pre-positive, even ontological assertion of the most central tenet of civilized human interaction should be inserted into the paramount legal texts. If law alone could not deter humans from brutality, the mention of the most significant criterion of mutual respect, and as such, of the most important pre-positive foundation of law should be introduced itself into legal documents of constitutional and international rank. In order to link rules to a higher legitimacy and to provide for a more adequate guarantee of the precondition of a humane social and political interaction. If you want, that can lead to a kind of paradox. In order to protect the law from its violation, one of its most important preconditions should be now enshrined into the law itself. As a result of the new attitude, the reference to human dignity was inserted into many of the new constitutions that came into force between the end of the Second World War and the present time. At the same time, at the international level, as the cosmopolitan warranty of humanity and as a standard for norms and policies of the individual states, human dignity was established as the core element of the Declaration of Rights of the international community. Yet, while human dignity is thus a relatively recent phenomenon and element in constitutional and international law, the assertion of the right to religious freedom has been regarded as an essential constituent of the catalogues of fundamental rights since the time of the American and French revolutions. Proclaimed in the Section 16 of the Virginia Bill of Rights, reasserted then in the First Amendment of the U.S. Constitution and confirmed in Article 10 of the Déclaration des droits de l'homme et du citoyen, it became a kind of topos of liberal and democratic constitutionalism in the 19th and 20th centuries. If we consider the relation now between the assertion of human dignity in general and the affirmation of the specific single human rights in the most central law instruments of the international community, the impression arises that dignity plays the role of a kind of ontological foundation of all proclaimed rights. This is particularly evident in the preambles of both the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights and the International Covenant on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights, which in unison state that the proclaimed rights derive from the inherent dignity of the human person. Moreover, the centrality of dignity had been already asserted, albeit in a less apodictive way, in the preamble as well as in Article 1 of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. All these human rights texts contain, among the proclaimed rights, the assertion of religious freedom. The consequence that might be drawn thus is that dignity can serve as an ontological basis also for the right to religious freedom. Yet such a claim is far from self-evident. Rather, the capacity of the concept of human dignity to deliver the necessary link of legal discourses on religious freedom to the pre-legal conditions of a peaceful and respectful human interaction depends largely on how the concept of dignity may be interpreted. Therefore, starting from these general considerations, I will raise three questions in the following. The first question aims at exploring the traditional understanding of human dignity, asking whether it can be considered as a suitable ontological foundation for religious freedom. If the answer to this first question is negative, a second question should be discussed: which alternative we have to the concept of human dignity. If the traditional understanding of dignity is affected by a flaw from the outset and the alternative transforms the religious dimension in a purely private domain, then we should ask, third and last, whether a different concept of dignity and its possible reconciliation with autonomy could not help us to find a suitable way. Let's begin thus with the first question. That means whether the traditional understanding of human dignity can be regarded as an adequate ontological foundation for religious freedom. Traditional understanding of human dignity is the same as saying religiously based conception of human dignity. Good reasons exist to believe that a basic idea of human dignity can be found within the cultural inheritance of the great part of existing civilizations, and in particular of all world religions. In non-theistic religions such as Buddhism, human dignity can be generally related, like in nearly all moral theories, to the capacity of human to differentiate between what is right and what is wrong. In contrast, in the theistic religions, and particularly in monotheism, the outstanding worth of human beings depends directly on God's revelation and on the belief that God gave humans an outstanding position among all creatures. However, the religiously based idea of human dignity is always characterized by some relevant shortcomings. Starting with the non-theistic approach, the claim to human dignity in Buddhism is not only a relatively new phenomenon with rather fragile roots in the tradition, but embeds also the human capacity to moral judgment, unlike reflexive moral theories, into a holistic and organicist view of the whole world. However, if what is here declared to be the main justification of the worth of man is only regarded as a part of a harmonic and coherent whole, it becomes difficult to understand what the specificity of human condition should be. Only this uniqueness yet gives us the ultimate reason to assert that humans deserve distinctive care and attention among all living and non-living entities in the universe. Coming now to the theistic traditions in general and to monotheism in particular, the idea of a privileged relation of humans to a personal God seems to be, at least at the first glance, an excellent starting point to claim the uniqueness of man. Nevertheless, what appears to be the specific strength of monotheism can also turn out to be its main weakness. In Judaism, for example, although the respect for human dignity may supersede, under certain circumstances, rabbinic law, it can never be regarded as generally superior to the highest commandment, namely to the honor owed to God and to His laws. Therefore, the principle of human dignity should not be used to disregard the laws of God. The strict connection of human dignity with religious commandment is also evident in Islamic tradition. Here we have, beside the doctrinal school of Ash'ariya, which assert that human dignity can be derived exclusively from Allah's will laid down in Holy Quran, we have also the more rationalistic approach of the Mu'tazila school as well, in which human dignity can be drawn from both the Holy Scripture and rational considerations, albeit also these should be substantiated in the holy texts. Precisely this kind of final derivation of human dignity from God's will is the root of the main deficit that affects the monotheistic conception of the alleged unique worth of man. Indeed, if his distinctive value is drawn from an incontestably free decision of the Creator, it will be quite difficult to declare human dignity as an inherent quality of human ontological and social condition, because it derives from outside. But if human dignity has to be derived from extra-human sources, it could hardly be regarded as an ultimate good, depending only on what human beings owe to themselves and to their fellow humans. Moreover, if the assertion and protection of human dignity hangs of the profession of faith of single and distinct religious community in the individual and distinct divinities, two further questions arise. First, how can a universal claim descend from the belief of a specific community in the incontestability of a particular revelation, which, however, is not shared by the members of other communities? Being based on faith, the dialogue on dignity could not reach argumentatively beyond the scopes of the different communities, turning out to be, lastly, religion in turn. Second, what happens to individuals and peoples who do not belong to the religious community, which is regarded by its members as the right and only holder of religious truth and therefore also of the foundation of human dignity? Are they not in continuous danger to be persecuted or at least discriminated? These problems are perfectly exemplified by lights and shadows developed in the Christian tradition. Christendom is doubtlessly the theistic religion that has most profoundly shaped the Western understanding of human dignity, as well as, at least indirectly, the legal discourse on it. Christian philosophy developed the idea of human dignity mainly from the vision of man as image of God, present in the ancient Testament and first outlined by the Jewish tradition. According to the Catholic understanding, human dignity, based on the image of God, has not been corrupted by original sin, and is therefore complete and integral in every human being. This universalism in nuce was reinforced, moreover, by the belief shared also by the Protestant doctrines that the Christian gospel is addressed to all humans. The universalistic horizon in moral philosophy and theology did not deter, however, Catholic countries from barbaric persecution and enslavement of non-Christian peoples, nor it prevented Catholic theologians and philosophers from sometimes crude, sometimes subtle justification of discrimination and persecution. Unlike the Catholic doctrine, Protestant theologians generally assumed that human dignity had been damaged by original sin and could be completely restored only in a eschatological perspective, and at the end of the world, actually. In the best case, the final re-establishment of the perfection of man's privileged nearness to God could be anticipated by a strict observation of religious precepts within the communities of the elect. This assumption favored, lastly, the establishment of social and legal rules which were openly discriminatory against the members of other religious communities and even more against atheists. In any case, the reference to man as the image of God seems not to provide, on the basis of what I've said, a sufficient basis for a really universalistic understanding of human dignity, not to speak of a convincing justification of religious freedom. Indeed, the idea of Imago Dei links dignity to the faith in a specific individual God, always putting, therefore, those who are outside this specific religious community into condition of at least potential inferiority. Therefore, the assumption of the nearness of man to God does not guarantee a universalistic respect for human dignity or an effective protection of religious freedom. Belonging to a religious group or faith is a highly intimate question of conscience. A universalist based only on religious precepts, thus, is lastly doomed to fail. Being therefore the answer to the first question negative in my perspective, in my eyes, let's move on now to the second. That means to the search of an alternative to the traditional concept of human dignity as the ontological foundation of religious freedom. The consequence of the ambiguities of the religiously based understanding of dignity and religious freedom was that the case for liberty in worshipping God following one's own conscience was based since the end of the 17th century on religiously neutral assumptions. This position was first introduced by John Locke in his Letter Concerning Toleration of 1689 and developed later to the legal and political position known usually as a rigid defense of the separation between public and religious domains. The conceptual move from the revelation-related vision of man as Imago Dei to the liberal understanding of religious freedom is characterized by two important aspects. First, human rights, and therefore also religious freedom, are not based anymore on dignity as the ontological liaison connection between man and the whole, and the universe, but on the free will of individual subjects, thus on autonomy. Second, the liberty to worship God following one's own conscience does not rely any longer positively on the appreciation for the high richness and social value of reflections on the most deep and involving existential questions, but lastly, negatively, on the indifference of the societas civilis, of the political society, for such dimensions of human life. Precisely because of the alleged political irrelevance of existential and religious dimensions of human life, religious plurality should be tolerated, not positively protected. The interpretation of religious freedom as a consequence of toleration, not of recognition of the positive value of the plurality of religious discourses, is affected, however, by serious deficits. The first problem arises if we consider that the political and juridical institutions are by far less neutral than we usually believe and assume. Rather, they mirror the cultural, historic, and religious tradition of a country. Thus, if the political and juridical institutions of the society do not actively protect the general conditions for the free exercise of religious and cultural practice, that means of religious plurality, the minorities are likely to be discriminated. The second questioner contests the assumption that acceptance of religious plurality depends on the indifference of political institutions to existential discourses, and lastly, on the irrelevance of the latter for other domains of social life. But is it really true that political and juridical institutions cannot actively protect practices of cultural and religious groups without losing their impartiality, provided that they do it with all groups which are not breaking fundamental laws of peaceful coexistence? And is it really a fallback into an old-fashioned bigotry if we claim that the whole society benefits from a lively involvement of a large part of the community in serious and committing discourses on the existential, moral, and religious dimensions of life? To sketch the essential traits of a possible answer to the shortcomings of both illustrated positions, it is necessary to move on to the third question. That is, to whether a different concept of dignity could not help us to find a suitable way. The active protection of religious freedom can be justified by resorting to the idea of a universal human dignity only if we meet successfully to the following two challenges. First, the concept of human dignity should be amended from privileged connections to religious beliefs, as well as from the condition of individual belonging to a specific religious community. Second, religious plurality should not be seen as a matter of facts that has to be accepted so as to avoid disruptive social tensions or because religious questions do not matter in the public sphere, but should be recognized as an added value for the richness of social discourse. To the first point. The religiously based conceptions of human dignity draw the conviction of the outstanding worth of man from a source which, at least in the eyes of their supporters, is ontologically located outside human society, derives from outside, from God, from God's will. Furthermore, in theism, this source consists in the will of an individual and thus particular deity. If the concept of human dignity should supersede the shortcomings of heteronomy and particularism, it must be directly founded, therefore, on human beings themselves. And human interaction as well as human society must be conceived of as universal in their scope. What steps were undertaken for the first time in Western thought by the Stoic philosophy 2,300 years ago. Yet my proposal is a different one and is based on the communicative understanding of reason. Quite philosophical question. According to the communicative paradigm of social order, which has been developed for the most part by Karl Otto Haber and Jürgen Habermas, communication, in order to work, that means in order to work so that we can understand each other, always presupposes the mutual recognition by all participants in the discursive interaction. In other words, discursive communication can achieve its goal, that means we understand each other, only if all those involved mutually assume that, A, from an objective perspective, the assertions are true, in the sense that the propositions are referred to real situations or facts. B, from a subjective perspective, the speakers act truthfully, in the sense that they are committed to fair-minded purposes and are sincerely persuaded that their assertions meet the conditions for truth. In other words, they are not cheating. C, from an intersubjective perspective, the speakers interact according to the principles of rightness, in the sense that they accept that their assertions have to meet the criteria for a general and mutual acknowledgement by all participants in the communication. That means if I meet one with a better argument than my argument, I have to accept it. If I don't accept this principle, we will not understand each other actually. Against the background of the communicative paradigm, human dignity is not based on metaphysical assumption, but is concretely rooted in the normative pragmatics of human interaction. According to this understanding, namely, human dignity is thus not an abstract principle, but illustrates an actual modus operandi of human beings in their relations to each other. It is the principle of mutual recognition. Moreover, dignity is still intersubjective in its essence, since it does not describe primarily a quality of individuals conceived as single and isolated subjects, but an inherent feature of functioning and normatively non-curtailed social communication. In other words, it is the concept that denotes in general the mutual compliance with the conditions of recognition within the pragmatic context of social interaction. Dignity is the recognition that we display in our communication. From the perspective of the communicative paradigm, the concept of human dignity is integrated by two corollaries which are significant for our purpose. First, the boundary that traditionally divided dignity and autonomy is fading away. In the communicative understanding, indeed, autonomy, both individual and collective, is the condition for the realization of a non-metaphysical conception of dignity as the status of mutual recognition. And dignity, on the other side, is nothing else but the guarantee that autonomy does not degenerate into a mere solipsistic arbitrariness, insofar as it always maintained the standards of reciprocity and self-respect as the prerequisites of a normatively full-fledged social interaction. Second, the communicative paradigm allows us a better comprehension of the distinction between the religious dimension and the public sphere. According to the communicative understanding of social order, society is the sum of different forms of interaction, each of them centered on a specific discourse. These different forms of interaction operationalize diverse understanding of reason and lead eventually to separate normative results. One of these forms of interaction concentrates on issues regarding the existential identity of the self and of the community. Here, individuals communicate with each other in order to clarify the sense of their lives as individuals and as a culturally specific group. The privileged context of this kind of communication is the religious, Weltanschauung-based, ideological or cultural community, held together by shared values aiming to give an answer to existential questions. The values elaborated in this kind of communication do not claim to be universal. Rather, they express principles on which individuals want to orientate their existence. The members of a religious group, for instance, may be deeply convinced that their beliefs are the best solution to find a sense of life, but no justification can be given to impose them on members of other cultural or religious communities, for example, through compelling laws. In a liberal and non-metaphysical society, no observance of substantive principle of life conduct should be demanded or ought to be demanded from all members of the society. In contrast, we speak of a political dimension of the social discourse when the communication is about the political identity of the community. That means when the members of a society are arguing about the best way in order to address the shared issues of public concern. In this case, individuals are not searching for existential sense, nor is the discourse centered on identity questions. Rather, the topic consists in elaborating, as a result of an inclusive discussion, the best ways to a good government of society. That means to an order which offers to all citizens the best possible chances to self-realization and self-enhancement. The distinction, therefore, between existential and political discourses on the basis of the topics on which the discursive interaction respectively concentrates makes possible to distinguish clearly the religious from the public domain, beyond any possibility of confusion. Nonetheless, neither domain can be considered self-sufficient, since each of them, despite its specificity, is interlinked with the others through the role played by the communicative understanding and communicative rationality. Indeed, through the criteria of the respect for objective truth, subjective truthfulness, and intersubjective rightness, communicative reason characterizes all spheres of human interaction in which strategic or functional thinking are not reason's last words. And now to the second challenge and to the end of my presentation. If existential and thus also religious discourses are an essential component of intersubjective communication, what is it about the plurality of such discourses? Should it be just tolerated, or is it a value that has to be protected? The question concentrates actually on how toleration should be understood. In Locke's view, as I presented before, toleration corresponds to a substantial indifference of the public sphere towards the religious dimension of individual and collective experience. In the history of political philosophy, however, we can find also another approach, which had been prominently contended at the same time of Locke's writing by Pierre Bayle. In his Commentaire philosophique, Bayle maintains that religious plurality is not just harmless for political stability. To the contrary, it is downright a blessing for the society. Although Bayle remarkably uses for his justification of religious plurality the same word employed by Locke just a couple of years later, namely toleration, his conception is quite different. In his view, religions are namely in the same mutual relationship, he writes, as artisans or tradesmen who, though each of them concentrated on his own work, cooperate for the sake of the common good. But what is this kind of cooperation which Bayle at least implicitly addresses? The different confessions enrich, in his eyes, each other through the mutual stimulation to seek for ever more profound, touching, and convincing answers to religious and existential questions. Thereby, religious plurality improves scope and quality of existential and religious discourses within a society, making it at large culturally livelier and ethically stronger. The condition for such a positive development, Bayle adds, is that public power protects the distinct religious communities with the same energy and commitment. Not only tolerates plurality, but protect the plurality of religious community. The danger does not arise, therefore, from plurality, but from its opposite, namely from persecution as the violent imposition of homogeneity. What Bayle is delineating here, thus, is an ambitious theory of recognition in which the different religious communities mutually acknowledge the equal worth and dignity of their respective ways to worship God following their own conscience, or even of not worshipping any deity. Creating this way a common space of respectful communication and a virtuous circle between individual faith, religious identity of groups, and the common good above them all. From this perspective, religious freedom does not describe an empty place indifferent to public power, but is a value worth being actively defended and supported. If we accept that dignity as a communicative value and existential religious discourses are an important component of social communication, we can assert at last that religious freedom is indeed based on the broad concept of human dignity, and that the defense of religious plurality is a fundamental task of any political and juridical institution that cherishes the cultural and ethical improvement of the society. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. I'd like to open the floor. Are there any questions or comments?